You're standing in a mall. It is 1993. The fluorescent lights hum above you. The carpet is that gray-brown color that somehow feels like a hug and a warning at the same time. You're holding a catalog. It is 400 pages thick, and it lands on your doorstep every single week. You do not throw it away, however. You flip through it. You circle things, you call a number, and a voice on the other end takes your order. It then arrives in a box, and it feels like Christmas, even in July. This was the single most powerful retail machine ever built. It delivered everything to everyone, everywhere, before the internet even knew what it wanted to be. It had the data, it had the logistics, it had the customer, it had every possible advantage. And then it lost everything. The story you have heard is that Sears died because Amazon killed it, that the internet came and the old department store could simply not keep up. That's the headline. That is a comfortable, easy version of the story, but it's also completely wrong. Sears did not die because it was outcompeted. Sears died because it was so successful that it became convinced it understood everything, and that conviction made it blind to the one thing it needed to see. The company that invented modern retail did not fall to a competitor. It fell to a cognitive bias, a bias even you carry in your own brain right now. The psychologist David Dunning and his graduate student Dunning-Kruger published a paper in 1999 that changed how we think about incompetence. Their finding is brutal and beautiful and almost too simple to believe. People who are unskilled at a task do not just perform poorly, but they also lack the very ability to judge their own performance. They are incompetent twice over, once in the doing and once in the knowing. The term you may know is Dunning-Kruger effect, and it is almost always explained as a problem for the unqualified. The guy who has no idea what he is talking about, but also talks the loudest. The startup founder who raises millions on a napkin drawing. The executive who has never built anything, but somehow runs everything. But there's a second version of the Dunning-Kruger effect, a version that applies to people who have been incredibly successful for a very long time. They become so accustomed to being right that they forget that being right yesterday does not guarantee anything about tomorrow. They confuse past outcomes with permanent wisdom. They mistake pattern recognition for prophecy. And this is the version that killed Sears. Sears was founded in 1886 as a mail-order watch company. By 1893, it had a catalog. By 1906, it had a massive distribution center in Chicago. By the 1920s, Sears was everywhere. You could buy a house from Sears, a prefabricated home that arrived on a train and you assembled it yourself. You could buy a car, you could buy a piano, you could buy absolutely anything. By 1969, Sears was the largest retailer in the United States. It had 72,000 employees, 1,600 stores, and revenue of more than $8 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that is nearly $70 billion in today's money. It was bigger than Walmart, bigger than Target, bigger than the combined revenue of every company you now associate with retail. Sears also had something that no other retailer had. It had a data infrastructure so advanced that it was decades ahead of its time. The catalog generated data. Every order, every address, every item, every purchase pattern. Sears knew what you bought, when you bought it, and how often you bought it. They had your history going back generations. They knew when a family of 3 became a family of 4. They knew when a baby had become a toddler. This was the raw material of the internet economy. Data about customers, data about demand, data about supply, and Sears was sitting on mountains of it. In 1982, Sears launched a new business unit. It was called Prodigy. It was an online shopping service. You connected to it through your television and a telephone modem. It was clunky and slow, and the screen was green and black, and it also cost $10 an hour just to use. But it existed. In 1994, when the internet was still mostly a curiosity, Jeff Bezos started Amazon. He sold books from his garage. He had inventory, he had a website, he had a plan. It was small and fragile, and any serious retailer could have copied it overnight. Sears could have copied it. Sears could have eaten Amazon for breakfast. It had the capital, it had the distribution, it had the customer trust, it had the data, It had everything except the willingness to admit that it did not already know the future. The key moment of refusal came from Arthur C. Martinez. He was the CEO of Sears at the time. He was asked about the internet, and he said, "We do not want to become a victim of our own success." Think about that sentence. We do not want to be a victim of our own success. It sounds wise, it sounds prudent, it sounds like careful management. It is actually a confession. It is a confession that you will believe your current success is the natural order of things, that any change is a threat, that disruption is something that happens to other people, to less competent people, to people who don't have your data, to people who do not have your history, to the people who are not Sears. And he wasn't alone. In 1996, the CEO of an American retailer said, and this is also a quote, "The internet is a fad. It will not last." His name was Walter S. Mossberg, and he was writing about it in the Wall Street Journal. He was telling anyone who would listen that this was the biggest shift in commerce since the railroad, and the people running the largest retailer in the world just shrugged. Why did they shrug? Why did they not see what was coming? This is where the behavioral economics explanation begins. The economist Daniel Kahneman wrote about two systems of thinking. One is fast. It is instinct. It is a pattern recognition. It is what you use to drive home without remembering the turns. System 2 is slow. It is deliberate. It's something you would use when doing your taxes. You need to make sure everything is perfect. Successful executives spend their entire careers relying on System 1 to make decisions quickly. They trust their gut. They pattern match from decades of experience, and most of the time, it works. Most of the time, the pattern repeats. Most of the time, the market behaves the way it always has. But sometimes it does not. And when it does not, the pattern matchers are the last ones to see it. They do not see the new pattern because the new pattern does not fit into any of their existing models. They do not see the threat because the threat looks like noise. The threat looks like a garage. The threat looks like a green and black screen with a $10 an hour modem. This is the second version of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The experts who have been right for so long that they assume they will always be right. The leaders who mistake their own confidence for evidence. The corporations that believe their own annual reports. Sears had 4 million square feet of distribution space. It had a fleet of trucks. It had relationships with every single manufacturer in America. It had the single most recognizable brand in American retail. And Amazon just had a garage. And Sears looked at that garage and saw nothing. It saw novelty. It saw a hobby. It saw distraction. It saw something that could never threaten them. The irony is that Sears was already doing what Amazon would eventually do. It just did not know that it was doing it. The catalog was the original e-commerce platform. The fulfillment centers were the original warehouses. The delivery network was the original last-mile logistics. Sears had built the entire infrastructure of modern online retail, and then it convinced itself that the infrastructure was not the point. The stores were the point. The physical presence. The carpet that smelled like a hug, and the glowing fluorescent lights. In 2000, Sears spent $250 million to acquire a new website. They called it Sears.com. It was years behind Amazon at this point. It was slow and clunky and incomplete. They did not invest in it. They did not defend it. They kind of just treated it as an afterthought. By 2005, Amazon had revenue of nearly $8.5 billion. Sears was still the largest retailer in America by physical footprint, but the gap was closing, and Sears did not see it. In 2010, Sears reported a loss of $573 million. In 2012, it reported another loss. In 2014, it sold its iconic Chicago headquarters. In 2015, it sold the entire Craftsman brand, the one every American man had in his garage, to Stanley Black & Decker. It sold its soul for $1,200 per square foot. And then, in 2018, Sears filed for bankruptcy. The company that invented the catalog, the company that delivered everything to everyone, the company that had all the data and all the distribution and all the trust, was gone. It had been surpassed by a company that started in a garage. The researchers who study organizational failure have a name for this. They call it the competence trap. It is the tendency for successful organizations to become so good at doing what they're already doing that they cannot learn to do anything else. They optimize for efficiency, they optimize for consistency, they optimize for repeatability, and in doing so, they become incapable of adaptation. The management theorist Clayton Christensen wrote about this in his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. He studied why successful companies fail. He found that failure is rarely about technology, it's rarely about competition. It is almost always about culture, the culture of success and the culture of certainty, the culture that says, we already know. Christensen argued that companies fail because they listen too carefully to their existing customers. They give them what they want, they maximize current profits, and in doing so, they miss the new market, the market that does not exist yet, the market that does not have customers yet, the market that only has a garage and a green and black screen. This is not a story about the internet. This is a story about you and your brain and the tiny voice that says, you already know. The voice that tells you to trust your gut. The voice that tells you the patterns are reliable, and the voice that tells you not to worry. You feel that voice every day when you scroll past a headline, when you dismiss a new idea, when you tell yourself that your career is secure, when you assume your industry is immune. That voice is not your friend. It is your corporate ego. It is your Dunning-Kruger effect. It is the thing that makes you believe you're safe when the ground is already shifting beneath you. Sears died because it could not admit that it did not know. It could not admit that a garage was a threat. It could not admit that its data was a liability, not an asset, if you refused to interpret it honestly. It could not admit that the future might look nothing like the past. You are not Sears, but you carry the same brain. You make the same mistakes. You trust the same patterns. Sears did not lose to the internet. It lost to itself. It lost to the comfortable certainty that it had nothing left to learn. The catalog did not kill the store. The store did not kill the catalog. The refusal to ask what comes next killed everything. You're standing in a mall, and it's 2026. The lights still hum. The carpet is still gray-brown, but the store that once filled every square foot of the space is gone. It was replaced by a section of a larger store, and then by a sign, and then by nothing. It was replaced by a company that started in a garage, and the only thing that stood between them was a belief that they already knew. That belief cost them everything, and it will cost you something too, if you let it. So the question is not whether you are right, the question is whether you are willing to ask if you might be wrong. Do you have the courage to be uncertain? Do you have the curiosity to question yourself? Do you have the humility to learn what you do not know? Or will you be the next company that had every advantage, every piece of data, every reason to succeed, and lost it all because you thought you already knew? You know which path Sears chose. The question is whether you will choose the other one. It starts with one word. The hardest word for any successful person to say. The word is not no. The word is maybe. Maybe I am wrong. Maybe I do not know. Maybe the future does not look like the past. Maybe a garage is worth paying attention to. Maybe. Just maybe.